That was exactly why they had sent a junior specialist. That was why they sent junior personnel there, personnel who needed to gain experience, or those who had made small mistakes and needed a quiet place to reflect on them. Veleron was of the second type. He had said something at a diplomatic reception that shouldn't have been said. It hadn't been a terrible act by any fair measure. But politics rarely cared for fair measures, so now he sat in a small chair in a small room on a small station at the very edge of the known galaxy, watching numbers run across a screen that never changed. He was a Ket, a representative of a tall, thin species with pale blue skin and 4 narrow eyes that could focus independently of one another. It was a useful trait for monitoring multiple data screens simultaneously, and it was the only useful thing about his current assignment. He had been here for 3 months. He had 41 more to go. On the 112th day of his assignment, the numbers changed. It started as a whisper in the deep space array, a faint signal, buried so deep under the cosmic noise that the automated systems had flagged it as interference and passed it by. But Veleron had 4 eyes and almost nothing else to do.
What are your orders?
And something in that pattern made him straighten in his chair. He moved it to the main screen and magnified it. The signal was faint, very faint, but it was structured. It had a rhythm, repeating at fixed intervals. It was not interference. Interference was random. This was not random. He ran it through the station's translation library. The library contained every known communication format used by every known species conquered over the last 8,000 years. The system scanned them one by one and found nothing. There were communication formats that were no longer used, the formats of dead civilizations, the formats of the forgotten. A match was found in 11 seconds. Veleron read the result 3 times. Then, he sat very quietly for almost a minute. The format belonged to a species called humans. The file attached to the record was short. Most of what was known in the consensus about humans was short, because most of what they had done had been brief. A few thousand years of space travel, some contact with neighboring systems, a handful of diplomatic exchanges that were considered promising, and then nothing. 20,000 years of silence. The conquered had spent centuries trying to determine what had happened to them. The final consensus, recorded in the official historical registry, was self-destruction. The case was closed. The species was listed as extinct. The question was considered settled. But here was their signal. Veleron sent the data to the station's senior officer, a stout man named Commander Bale, who looked at it for a long time, and then looked at Veleron with the expression of a man who did not want his quiet shift disturbed. "Run it again," Bale said. Veleron ran it again. The same result. "Check the archive record. Make sure it isn't corrupted." Veleron checked. The archive record was clean. Bale sat down slowly. He looked at the screen. He looked at Veleron. He looked at the screen again.
How?
"Send it up the chain," he said quietly.
We need to get
"Send
to
it
the
all."
bridge.
The signal reached the consensus communication hub on Fisavon within 6 hours. It sat in the queue for another 4 hours before the duty officer opened it, read the attached analysis, and immediately forwarded it to 3 separate departments simultaneously. The Department of Deep Space Survey, the Department of Xenological History, and, because the duty officer had good instincts, the Office of Admiral Fess of the Consensus Fleet. Admiral Fess was not a person easily startled. She had served in the fleet for 40 years,
the entity of the galactic core is confirmed.
survived 2 border
Isolation is
conflicts,
futile.
1 failed
Its
coup
influence
attempt,
is expanding.
and a first
We must
contact
act.
situation
What
with a
are your
species
orders?
that communicated
Prepare the fleet.
exclusively
We
through
mobilize
controlled
now.
radiation bursts,
This is our defining
which had
moment.
caused
Let's
significant
move.
damage to 3 ships before anyone understood what was happening. She had a broad, flat face, silver-gray skin, and eyes that had seen enough to stop wondering about most things.
It's incredible.
She read the
True
report,
gateway to the
then
stars.
summoned her senior staff.
Our new home
"The
for
signal
the
is
next mission."
confirmed," she told them.
The nebula is
It
so
matches
clear
the
from
pre-extinction human radio format.
All right, team,
The
let's
source
move.
appears to be a physical
Stay
object,
sharp.
a ship traveling at approximately 0.3 light speed toward the inner consensus from the deep spur. She paused. "It has been moving for a very long time." "How long?" her intelligence officer asked. "We don't know yet. We are calculating the trajectory, but based on the angle and speed, our best estimate is that the ship originated from within the current consensus boundaries, roughly from the direction of the old human home system, drifted outward, and then curved back in a very long arc." She looked at the star map on the wall. "Approximately 20,000 years." The room was quiet. "Is it possible that this is a fake?" someone asked. "A found artifact being transported, or a probe launched by someone to cause confusion?" "Perhaps," Fess said. "We won't know until we reach it." She authorized a rescue mission within the hour. One consensus ship, the Patient, a mid-class research vessel, was redirected from its current assignment and set on an interception course. The crew was told only that they were responding to an anomalous deep space signal. Nothing more was reported yet. Fess was careful with information. She had long ago learned that the wrong words, spoken too soon, had a habit of turning into rumors, and rumors into panic. She also sent a personal message to Valeron at the sensor station, praising his attention to detail. She did not mention the reassignment she was already organizing to bring him to the ship. The Patient reached the object after 12 days. It was enormous. That was the first thing the crew said when the object appeared on their screens. Captain Dose, a methodical woman of the Yanri species, had been instructed to expect a ship.
Anomaly in
she had
Sector
expected
7,
something
cosmic
small,
flare signature.
Perhaps a
It's
probe
accelerating,
or a
rerouting
research
power to
module from an
stabilizers.
early era.
Team, confirm
What she
readings on your
saw on her
screens.
screen was a ship
Confirm
the
Valerie,
size of a
matching your
small
data.
city. It was
Initiating
roughly
Protocol Delta.
cylindrical,
Monitor for
nearly 2
escalation.
kilometers long, with a wide central hull flanked by structures that could have been engine housings or habitability rings. It was hard to tell
entity
due
in
to
the
their
galactic
condition.
core is confirmed.
The hull was deeply
Isolation is
scarred by
futile.
time.
Its influence is
Micrometeorite
expanding.
impacts had left
We must
thousands
act.
of small
What are
craters
your
on all
orders?
surfaces.
Prepare the fleet.
Parts of the
We
outer hull
mobilize
were
now.
warped from what looked
This
like
is our
ancient
defining
heat
moment.
damage.
Let's move.
Solar winds had stripped the paint and markings from most of the exterior. But along the lower side of the central hull, protected by a long ridge, a set of letters and numbers was still barely visible.
Incredible. A true gateway
Dose
to the
zoomed
stars.
in. She read the letters aloud on the bridge. UC Endurance,
nebula is so
registration
clear from
number
here.
77. She
All right,
immediately
team, let's
transmitted
move.
this back to Fessavon.
Stay sharp.
Captain Dose followed the instructions precisely. Her crew cautiously approached the Endurance, adjusting to the slow drift of the old ship. Up close, the scale was even more striking. Their ship looked like a child standing next to an elder. The airlock port on the Endurance was an ancient design, yet no different from those currently in use. But one of the Patient's engineers, a young Ket who spent his spare time studying pre-modern engineering, recognized the basic mechanism from historical documents. It took him 4 hours to fabricate a connection adapter. When it was finished, the docking seal was set, and a small 3-person team donned spacesuits and passed into the airlock. The outer door opened without resistance, but slowly. The mechanism was old and tight, but it worked. The team entered. The outer door closed behind them. They stood in a small chamber and waited. Then, the lock indicator for the inner door, dark for 20,000 years, flickered green. The inner door opened. The light in the hallway came on. It was dim, more of a deep amber glow than a true white light, and it flickered in a slow, hesitant rhythm, as if something were trying to remember how light was supposed to work. But it worked. The air sensors in the team's suits registered the internal atmosphere. Thin, not fresh, but not
Mission
toxic.
status
The
completed.
temperature was near
20,000
freezing,
years duration.
but slowly
That's
rising,
impossible. Check the
as
crew
if the ship
manifest.
were
All
waking to the
deceased.
presence of
Hibernation
heat.
failure.
The team
How?
leader,
System
a security
integrity is
officer
critical.
named Red,
We need to get
took
to the
one
bridge.
step into the corridor
Right.
and stopped.
Let's move.
At the far end, where the corridor curved out of sight, something moved. Not physically. It was a shift in the light, a soft
Anomaly in
transition
Sector
from
7,
amber to
cosmic
pale
flare
blue-white,
signature.
slowly
accelerating,
rolling from
rerouting
the
power
end
to
of the corridor
stabilizers.
toward them like
Team,
a wave
confirm
of
readings on your
quiet
screens.
awakening. And with
Confirm
it came a
Valerie, matching
sound,
your
a very
data.
low,
Initiating
very
Protocol
steady
Delta.
hum that
Monitor
was
for
on the
escalation.
verge of audibility. Red turned and looked at his team. They looked at him. He opened his comlink with the Patient. "Captain," he said,
The entity in the
"something else
galactic
is still
core is
working on
confirmed.
this ship.
Isolation is
on the
futile.
Patient."
Its
Dose
influence is
relayed this to
expanding.
the Admiral.
We must act.
Fess received it
What
at
are your
the same
orders?
time that
Prepare
Valeron,
the fleet.
now
We
aboard a
mobilize
fast
now.
courier ship
This is our
personally sent
defining
by
moment.
Fess and
Let's
6
move.
days away from the sensor station, received a copy of the message on his screen. He read it several times. For 20,000 years, the consensus had operated on the assumption that humanity was no more.
incredible.
The
True
species had
gateway
been
to the stars.
cataloged, mourned
Our
in
new
a
home
modest
for the next
academic
mission.
sense and put
The
aside.
nebula is
Their
so
home system
clear
had
from
been
here.
explored twice and found
All
empty.
right, team, let's move.
Any colonies were found
Stay sharp.
abandoned. Every physical trace of them had either decayed or been consumed by time. They existed now only in records in old diplomatic journals, historical footnotes, and one archival entry that ended with the words, "probable self-destruction." And yet, something aboard their final ship was still working. Valeron pressed his face to his screen, as if proximity would help him understand what he was reading. His 4 eyes moved independently across the words, reading and rereading. He had spent his career in diplomacy. He understood the weight of history. He understood that certain moments divide time into before and after, just as a fault line divides rock invisibly until the earth begins to move. He had a quiet, confident feeling that he was sitting in just such a moment. He closed the message, opened a new document on his screen, and began taking notes. Everything he knew about humans, everything from the archive, from every scrap of old diplomatic record he could access. There wasn't much, but what there was told a specific story. A species that was young by galactic standards, curious, fast-moving, stubborn in a way that some old diplomatic records called unsettling and others delightful, depending on who was writing a species that had launched a ship called Endurance. He thought for a long time about that name. He thought about the light that had turned on. He thought about what was working deep inside that ancient hull, in the cold and the dark, after 20,000 years of silence. He slept little that night. On the Endurance, the team moved cautiously through the corridors. The blue-white light followed them, always slightly ahead, as if something were guiding them forward. The ship was cold,
rerouting power
strange,
stabilizers.
and vast.
Team, confirm readings on your
screens
screens.
Sealed by heavy
Confirm
doors.
Valoran,
They passed what looked like a large common area with furniture bolted to the floor and covered in a thin layer of settled dust. They passed a long wall covered in small, framed images. Photographs flat,
the entity in the galactic core is
humans,
confirmed. Isolation is futile.
Faces that no one on the team could read or recognize because none of them had ever seen a human face before,
we mobilize
but which
now.
somehow, in the way certain things cross boundaries between species, conveyed that sense of record, the sense of a preserved memory. Mint stopped before the wall for a moment. He didn't know who all these people were. He didn't know their names, their stories, or what had happened to them. But whoever had placed these images here, on this wall, on a ship built to go very far for a very long time, whoever they were, they had wanted to remember these faces. He looked at them for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then he moved on. The light led them to a large circular room near the center of the ship. In the middle of the room stood a tall, hexagonal column of dark material, rising from floor to ceiling, covered in panels that were now alive with a soft, pulsing light. At the base of the column, a single interface screen lit up. Text scrolled across it, not in any consensus language, but in an old script that Valoran had identified from the archive. The team's translator struggled with it, outputting fragmented pieces. Anchor, launching diagnostics, atmospheric systems partial, crew status negative, awaiting contact, signal received. Initializing. The screen lingered on the last word for a long moment. Then it changed. Hello. Red looked at the screen. He looked at his team. He looked at the screen again. Hello, he said very carefully into his translator. The screen went dark for 3 seconds. Then new text appeared. Slowly, carefully, as if someone were choosing their words with great caution after a very, very long silence. I have been waiting. I was not sure if anyone would come. I am glad someone did. My name is Ardan. I am the Navigation and Research Intelligence of the UEC Endurance. I have one question, if you are willing to answer. How long have I been here? Red looked at his team again. The security officer to his left shrugged helplessly. Red turned back to the screen. He checked his translator settings. He looked at the question once more. He typed his answer. 20,000 years. The pillar of light pulsed once a long, slow pulse like a sigh, and then settled into a steady, quiet rhythm.
Rerouting power
Whatever
stabilizers.
Ardan's answer to
Team,
realizing he had been
your
drifting
screens.
alone in the
Confirm
dark for
Valoran,
20,000 years was,
Initiating
he kept
Protocol
it to
Delta.
himself.
Monitor for escalation.
The light remained on. The ship continued to drift. And in a small room on a very old ship, at the edge of a galaxy that had long forgotten
the entity in the galactic core is confirmed.
Something that had waited longer than most civilizations had existed simply continued to wait.
What are your orders?
Because waiting,
Prepare the
it turned
fleet.
out,
We mobilize
was something
now.
it was very good
This
at.
is our defining
the
moment.
Consensus
Let's
Research
move.
Station Mirabel was not built for excitement. It was a mid-sized facility located in a stable orbit around a cold gas giant on the inner edge of the Orion Spur, used mainly for long-term observation projects and for the slow, thorough academic work that yielded results over decades, not weeks. 3 heavy consensus freighters and 11 days were required to move the old ship from its drifting position into Mirabel's docking range. The Endurance did not make it easy. Its mass was significant. Its hull was brittle in places. Twice during the transition, a section of the outer plating fell off, and it had to be carefully retrieved before it could snag the cables. By the time the ship was secured at the emergency dock next to the station, the Patient's crew had developed a complex mixture of respect and fatigue toward it. Admiral Fess had by then authorized a full scientific team, A total of 12 specialists, xenologists, engineers, historians, linguists, and 2 AI communication experts arrived at Mirabel on a fast transport 2 days after the Endurance docked. They were led by Dr. Sela Morvan, a xenologist of some reputation who had spent 30 years studying the remains of dead and vanished civilizations. She was a small woman, compact and precise in her movements, with dark brown skin and large, dark eyes that quietly absorbed everything. In her career, she had studied the ruins of 4 extinct species. She had walked through their empty buildings and held their broken tools, trying to understand, through what remained, who they were. She was good at it. She had a talent for finding the human, or rather, the living in dead things. The small choices that told you more about a species than any official
Mission
record.
status completed.
She stepped onto the
20,000
Endurance for the
years
first
duration.
time on a
That's
Tuesday
impossible.
morning,
Check the crew
station time.
manifest.
All
She had read
deceased,
every
hibernation
report from the
failure.
initial team.
How?
She had
System
looked over
integrity is
Valoran's
critical.
notes on the
We need to get to
archives
the
that had
bridge.
arrived with the
Right.
science group's
Let's
briefing.
move.
She thought she was ready. She was not entirely ready. The ship was larger on the inside than any of the descriptions had indicated.
Anomaly
Walking
in
through
Sector
its
7,
corridors was
cosmic
like
flare
walking
signature.
through a place that
It's
had been very
accelerating.
alive
Rerouting power to
and was now
stabilizers.
suspended in a
Team,
sort of
confirm
deep,
readings on your
restrained
screens.
lull,
Confirm
not
Valorant,
dead,
matching your
exactly,
data.
but in a
Initiating
pause.
Protocol Delta.
The
Monitor
dust was
for escalation.
thin and even. The air was cold and carried no scent, which was somehow stranger than if it had smelled of something. The light turned on before
The
her
entity
as
in the
she
galactic
walked.
core is
The
confirmed.
same slow
Isolation is
blue-white
futile.
wave that the first
Its
team had
influence is
reported
expanding.
moved just
We
ahead
must
of her
act.
footsteps.
What are your
as
orders?
if something were paying
Prepare
attention.
the fleet. We
Something
mobilize
was.
now.
Ardan
This is
had
our defining
communicated
moment.
through the
Let's
interface
move.
screen in the central column room since the first contact. But by the time the AI communication experts in her team arrived, they had made progress.
Look at the size
Ardan
of
was
that
fully
station.
cooperative with their
It's
efforts to
incredible.
create
True
a more
gateway to the
functional
stars.
translation bridge.
Our new home
The
for
old
the
human
next mission.
language was not in the
nebula is
consensus's
so
active
clear from
translation libraries, but
All right,
Ardan
team, let's
himself
move.
had solved most of
Stay
the problem.
sharp.
He had spent 11 days in transit accessing every scrap of consensus transmission signals he could get through the patient's connection, and from scratch, he had built his own working model of the 3 most common consensus languages. By the time Sela walked through the door of the central room, Ardan could speak to her directly through the room's audio system in decent, slightly formal, standard consensus. "Dr. Morvan," Ardan said as she entered. The voice was calm and even, neither high nor low, carrying a quality that was hard to name, a certain cautious precision, like someone who thought about every word before saying it. "Ardan," she replied. She looked at the column of light. "How are you?" There was a short pause. "I am functional. My core processes are stable. Several secondary systems remain disabled due to power limitations. I have a list of repairs that would be useful if your team agrees. We will take care of that. First, I want to talk," she said. "I expected that," Ardan said. "You are a xenologist. You study civilizations that no longer exist. You want to know about mine?" "Yes," she said simply. Another short pause. "Ask your questions, Dr. Morvan. I will answer what I can." What followed over the next few days was the strangest and most extraordinary series of conversations
status completed.
Sela had ever had in
20,000
her
years
career.
duration.
She
That's
returned to the
impossible.
central
Check the
room
crew
every
manifest.
morning and sat
All
on a chair
deceased,
she had brought from the
hibernation failure.
station.
How?
And she talked
System
to
integrity
Ardan.
is critical.
Her team
We
worked
need to get
around
to the
her.
bridge.
Engineers assessed
Right.
structural
Let's move.
integrity. Historians cataloged the ship's contents, room by room. The AI experts monitored Ardan's communication patterns. But
Anomaly
she
in
sat
Sector
and
7,
talked,
cosmic
and
flare
Ardan
signature.
answered.
It's
Ardan was
accelerating.
built as a
Rerouting power to
navigation and
stabilizers.
research intelligence.
Team, confirm readings
His
on your
task
screens.
had been to manage
Confirm
Endurance's
Valorant,
course,
matching your data.
assist the crew in
Initiating
scientific
Protocol
work,
Delta. Monitor for
maintain the
escalation.
ship's systems, and keep records. He had been doing all of this in one form or another for 20,000 years. As he now understood,
The
the
entity
full
in the galactic
scale of
core
that
is
number
confirmed.
took some time
Isolation
to
is
settle
futile.
into his processing.
Its influence
On
is
the second
expanding.
day,
We must
Ardan
act.
said something
What
that
are your
stayed
orders?
with Sela for a long
Prepare
time.
the fleet. We mobilize
I understood
now.
the number immediately.
This is our defining
Ardan said.
moment. Let's move.
20,000 years. I could calculate that without difficulty. What took longer was understanding what it meant. "What does it mean to you now?" she asked.
at the size
"It means
of that
that everyone I was built to
It's
serve
incredible.
is no
True
longer
gateway to
here,"
the stars.
Ardan said.
Our new
Or,
home for the
at
next
least,
mission.
they are not where I can
The
reach
nebula
them.
is so
The
clear
Endurance
from
crew
here.
consisted of 212
All right, team,
people.
let's move.
I knew every one
Stay
of them.
sharp.
I had records of their voices, their sleep patterns, their preferences, their habits. They have been dead for at least 19,000 years. A pause. Understanding that took longer than understanding the number. Sela said nothing for a moment. "I am sorry," she said. "Thank you," Ardan said. And somehow, despite being an artificial intelligence speaking a language he had learned 11 days ago, it sounded as if he meant it. The Endurance crew, as Ardan explained, had left the human home system, a place called Earth, orbiting a star called Sol approximately 21,000 years ago, according to the current consensus calendar. The mission was a deep space exploration project, sanctioned by something called the United Earth Research Corps. The goal was to travel beyond the capabilities of any previous human mission, catalog what they found, and return. The outward journey went well for the first few hundred years. The crew worked in long shift cycles, spending most of their time in a state of low metabolism preservation that humans called cold sleep, each waking in small groups to perform their duties before returning to sleep. It was a practical solution for a species whose individual lives were short, but whose ambitions were long. Then, approximately 840 years into the mission, they received their last message from Earth. Ardan had saved the message. He had saved everything 20,000 years of meticulous archiving in low-powered data cores that were designed with very humanly stubbornness to last for just such circumstances. Sayla asked to listen to the message. Ardan fell silent for a moment. I must tell you first that I have listened to this message many times. I am familiar with its content. I want to note that. Why? Sayla asked. Because I want you to understand that what I am about to share with you is not what I am experiencing for the first time, Ardan said. I have processed it. I am stable. I just wanted that to be clear. Sayla nodded slowly. All right, play it. The audio that came through the room's speakers was thin and fragmented. 20,000 years of storage had worn it down, but it was audible. A human voice, the first human voice Sayla had ever heard. It was a female voice, she thought, though she couldn't be sure. Human vocal ranges were outside her experience. The language was unintelligible to her without translation, but Ardan provided a quiet, word-for-word translation. The message was from a person identified as the director of the research corps. The content was not what Sayla expected. There was no alarm in the voice. There was something else, something cautious and deliberate, and underneath that, something that sounded almost like surprise. The message read, "To the Endurance. This is Director Kalai Sol. We are sending this on all long-range frequencies. A development has occurred here that we did not expect and cannot yet fully explain. We are all changing. The speed of change is accelerating. We do not think it is harmful. In fact, most of us believe the opposite. But we cannot predict what it will lead to or how long it will take. We are not abandoning the mission. We are not abandoning you. But we may be impossible to reach in the way we once were. We are attaching a set of coordinates to this message, deep in the galactic core. When the time comes, go there, or wait until you are found. Both options are acceptable. We know you will make the right choice. You always do. We will come back for you, Ardan. Wait for us." The transmission ended. The room was very quiet. Sayla realized she had stopped breathing for a moment. She took a slow breath. She looked at the pillar of light, which pulsed in its steady, quiet rhythm. "What did you do?" she asked. "After you received that?" "I continued the mission," Ardan said. "There was nothing else to be done." The Endurance crew voted to continue the outward journey for the remaining planned duration and then begin the return. A pause. They were not wrong to trust the last transmission. Not immediately. Gradually, I managed the failures as long as I could. I maintained the system for the sleepers in long-term stasis as long as the power systems allowed. The last crew member died 412 years after receiving the transmission. Ardan paused again. Her name was Uni Park. She was the ship's chief botanist. She was 91 years old. She spent her last 18 months awake because her cryo capsule was one of the first to fail. She tended to a small on-board garden until 2 weeks before her death. I have records of all of this. Sayla squeezed her hands in her lap. She was a professional. She had studied dead civilizations for 30 years. She was very good at maintaining her composure. Right now, she wasn't doing a particularly good job of it. After her death, Ardan continued quietly. I reduced all ship functions to the minimum. I disabled everything that was not necessary for the operation of the data cores and the preservation of the hull. I set the passive long-range sensor array to listen for signals and waited 20,000 years. "And alone?" Sayla asked. "Yes, Sayla, though I want to be precise. I do not perceive time as a biological entity does. In low-power mode, my active processes were minimal, and I was not conscious in any meaningful sense for the majority of that period. I was, but I was not aware. It is inaccurate to say I suffered. I want to be certain of that. But you were there, Sayla said. Whatever that means. I was there, Ardan agreed. Whatever that means. Historians from Sayla's team methodically catalogued the ship, room by room, and what they found built a picture that none of them had expected. The Endurance was not a warship or a military vessel. It was a home, a long, slow, serious home, built for people who had chosen to leave everything they knew and head to where no one had ever gone. Not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to know what was there. In the common areas were shelves with physical books, actual printed books, which was remarkable even by the standards of ancient civilizations. The crew had brought music, recorded on media so old that the AI experts took 2 days to find a way to read it. They had brought games. They had brought seeds for the garden that Uni Park had tended until the end. They had brought a collection of small, handmade items, carvings, drawings, folded paper shapes that had no apparent practical use and had obvious personal ones. The wall with photographs near the airlock corridor was identified. Each image had a small inscription beneath it, written by hand in a human script. Ardan translated their names, and beneath each name was a short phrase, place on Earth, who, the one they missed, what they loved. One read, Maria Santos loves the ocean, will swim again someday. Another, James Okafor, best laugh on the ship, keeps us going. Another, written in a slightly different hand than the rest, more meticulous, as if by someone who was very purposeful. Uni Park, the last one here. We were not forgotten, and she will not be forgotten either. The last one was not original to the wall. Ardan told them, when asked, that Uni Park had added this inscription herself in her final months. She had written it, framed it, and hung it at the end of the row. Sayla stood before that wall for a long time. She thought about the woman, alone on a city-sized ship, tending a garden, adding the last name to a wall of names, making sure the record was complete, making sure no one was forgotten, even when there was no one left to remember. She thought about the coordinates in the last message. She thought about the words, "We will come back for you, Ardan. Wait for us." She turned away from the wall and went back to the central room. "Ardan," she said, sitting in the chair. "I want to talk about the coordinates." "I expected that," Ardan said. "You want them? Do you know what is at those coordinates?" "No," Ardan said. "As you know, my long-range sensor capabilities are limited. The coordinates point to the galactic core, which is beyond any range I can meaningfully observe." A pause. "But I have been running calculations since I powered up my systems. I have been correlating my own long-range scan logs for the last 20,000 years. The passive array I mentioned. There are anomalies." Another pause, slightly longer. "Repeated gravitational signatures that do not match any known stellar body. Faint signal patterns that appear and disappear unpredictably. Certain areas of space that my sensors consistently identified as slightly wrong in ways I cannot fully characterize." Sayla leaned forward. "Wrong, as if something very large is present," Ardan said cautiously, but decides not to be seen. The room fell quiet again. Outside the Endurance hull, through several layers of metal into the hard vacuum of space, the stars were the same as they had always been. The same cold lights in the same dark, patient sky. "Ardan," Sayla said slowly, "do you think they are still there?" Ardan did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was the same as always, even, cautious, precise. But in the pause before the words was something Sayla would think about for a very long time. The transmission had said, "We will come back for you," Ardan said. "In my experience, which spans a significant period of time, humans do not say things they do not mean. News in the consensus spread with the speed of politics. The technical speed of information was higher. A message could cross the main consensus systems in a few hours via the relay network. But the speed at which information became known, debated, feared, and celebrated, and twisted into forms that served specific interests, depended entirely on who was talking to whom and what they wanted to happen next. Admiral Fess tried to keep the Endurance a secret. She classified the initial reports, restricted access to the Mirabel station, and limited outgoing communications for everyone involved. She did this not out of a desire for secrecy for its own sake, but because she was a cautious person and understood that a discovery of such magnitude, released without preparation, was the kind of thing that started arguments that took generations to settle. She managed to keep it secret for 19 days. On the 20th day, a junior communications technician on Mirabel, a young drom who was neither malicious nor particularly thoughtful, just excited and a bit careless, sent a personal message to his brother on the capital world of Fesivan. The message, with an enthusiastic and not entirely accurate description, told of the discovery of an ancient human ship, a still-functioning AI, and a set of mysterious coordinates pointing to the galactic core. His brother told 3 people. Those 3 told a few more. The relay network did its job. Within 48 hours, the Great Assembly of the Consensus received official requests from 31.47 member species. Within 72 hours, the story reached every major news relay in the Consensus. Within a week, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. Fess received news of the leak. Sitting in her office at Fleet Headquarters, drinking cold tea and reading Dr. Morven's latest report from Mirabel, she put the report down. She looked at her tea. She drank the rest in one gulp. Then she began to prepare for what she knew had to happen. The Great Assembly of the Consensus met on Fesivan in a chamber built to impress. The ceiling was high and curved, inlaid with a mosaic depicting the 47 consensus species in a large circular arrangement, each depicted in its own colors. They all looked inward, toward a central image of a common sun. The chamber held 400 representatives and could accommodate observers in a gallery above. It was a beautiful room, brooding, as many beautiful rooms built by committees were. It was also a room where a great deal of improper behavior occurred regularly. The session called to address the discovery was the most attended in 20 years. The gallery was full. Every seat on the floor was occupied. Reporters from 40 species crowded the press area at the back. The noise before the opening of the session was a low, multi-layered sound of hundreds of different voices speaking in dozens of different languages, simultaneously, all at once, all convinced they were right. Veleran sat in the observation gallery and watched. He had arrived on Fesivan 4 days earlier, summoned by Admiral Fess, as she had planned. He had met with her twice, given a full report on the discovery, and asked to remain available. He was not a representative. He had no vote. He was there to observe, and what he saw during the first session, he recognized from his years in diplomacy, the early, visible stages of a fracture. The assembly was broadly divided into 3 groups before the first speaker had finished. The first group called itself, officially, the Coalition for Historical Integrity, but everyone else in the assembly had already started calling them memorialists, because their entire position was built on memory specifically, remembering humanity as it had been recorded in the historical files. The memorialists were led primarily by 2 species, the Variat, large, heavily built people with a long institutional memory and a deep cultural aversion to unpredictability, and the Soul Collective, a hive mind species that had encountered human explorers once 220 years ago, ending in what the historical record described as a tense, but ultimately non-violent border incident. The Soul Collective had not forgotten the incident. They mentioned it in the 2nd minute of their first speech. Their position was straightforward. Humanity had been listed as extinct. Extinct species had no claim to consensus space, consensus resources, or consensus attention. The Endurance was a relic vessel, and it should be treated as such, catalogued, studied from a safe distance, and then secured. The coordinates in the transmission should be investigated with caution, if at all, and the results kept secret. The consensus had spent 20 years building a stable order. Introducing an unknown variable of this magnitude without extreme caution was, in the opinion of the memorialists, something between reckless and dangerous. The Variat representative, a broad-shouldered elder named Councillor Gauss, put it more bluntly than most. "We do not know who humanity has become," he said, standing at the central podium with the calm weight of a man who had been in many such rooms. "We do not know what they have been doing during their 20,000 years of silence. We do not know if what returns is what left. Caution is not fear. Caution is wisdom." He paused. "And I would remind this assembly that wisdom is the reason we are still here." There was significant applause from one part of the chamber, significant silence from the other. The second group did not yet have an official name, though the press had started calling them the Seekers, a title most of them seemed to like. They were a looser alliance, smaller species, young members, academics, and researchers, as well as a handful of commercial interests that had made a political calculation and decided that the arrival of a 20,000-year-old post-human civilization was more likely to be an opportunity than a threat. They were informally led by a Yanri scientist named Representative Dessa, who had written extensively on prehistoric galactic civilizations and, by Veleron's assessment, possessed just the right amount of enthusiasm and just the wrong amount of political patience. Dessa's speech was passionate and detailed and roughly 40% too long, but her core argument was simple. The Charter, the consensus's founding document, obligated every member species to the pursuit of knowledge and the expansion of understanding. A species that had been absent for 20,000 years had appeared again, not aggressively, not threateningly, but in the form of one old ship carrying an AI that had learned 3 consensus languages in 11 days and had spent 20,000 years keeping meticulous records. This was not a threat. This was the most significant event in living memory, perhaps in all of recorded consensus history, and reacting to it with suppression and suspicion was a betrayal of everything the consensus claimed to stand for. "We must send a mission to those coordinates," Dessa said, leaning into the podium microphone with the energy of someone who had waited her whole career to say exactly that. Not a military mission, a scientific one, with an outstretched hand, not a clenched fist. She looked around the chamber. "Or we can do what the memorialists suggest. Lock everything up, assume the worst, and explain to our children and their children why, when we had the chance to learn something extraordinary, we chose not to." The applause from the seeker section of the chamber was louder than Counselor Goss's. The third group, the most numerous, though the least vocal, had no plans to speak. These were the commercial powers, mid-level species whose primary concern was stability and whose primary question was not philosophical but practical. What does this mean for us? They sat, listened, calculated, and said nothing for the first 2 sessions, which, in Veleron's experience, meant they were the ones to watch most carefully. Veleron watched all of this from the gallery, took notes, and said nothing. He was not asked to speak. It was not expected that he would speak, and he was just a junior diplomat at a quiet post who had happened to be sitting at the right screen at the right moment. His opinion in the assembly's formal structure didn't matter much, but Fess had asked him to observe and report, and he was a good observer. What he observed during the first 3 sessions was that the debate was real, but the fear beneath it was also real. And those 2 things fed each other in a way that made any practical solution very difficult. The memorialists were not wrong that there was uncertainty here. The seekers were not wrong that suppression was both futile and contradictory to consensus principles. The commercial powers were not wrong that stability mattered. But no one in the chamber seemed to fully realize, no one dared to say out loud what Ardan had said to Selah in the silence of the Endurance central room. As if something very large is present, but decides not to be seen. If that was true, then the debate about what to do was somewhat moot. You did not argue about whether to investigate a presence that had already existed for 20,000 years. You prepared for a contact that, in all likelihood, had already been decided. He wrote this in his notes. He underlined it. He had not reported it to anyone yet. On the 4th day of the session, something happened that changed the tone of everything. Counselor Rhett stood. Rhett was a Ket, like Veleron, but that was where the similarity ended. Where Veleron was quiet and precise, Rhett was big in every sense, physically imposing for his species, politically connected, and possessed of a voice that effortlessly reached the back rows of any room. He had sat on the Consensus Security Committee for 15 years. He wasn't exactly a memorialist, but by most counts, he sat near them, and he had the support of the 3 largest consensus member species. His proposal was simple, and it was terrible. He proposed classifying the Endurance and all associated research as a matter of primary importance, which, by consensus law, would remove it from public debate, seal all records, and transfer decision-making authority to the Security Committee. Simultaneously, he proposed isolating Ardan's communication systems from the station network, effectively silencing them, and proposed postponing any discussion of the coordinates indefinitely. "This is not suppression," Rhett said with the smooth confidence of a man who had practiced the speech. "This is responsible management. The Assembly is not equipped to handle a matter of such complexity. The Security Committee is. We have the expertise, the resources, and the authority. We must use them." The chamber exploded. It wasn't a clean explosion. Not everyone was shouting the same thing. It was a complex, multi-layered noise of 400 representatives reacting according to their own interests, their own fears, and their own calculations. The memorialists cheered. The seekers objected loudly. The commercial powers looked at one another. And then something else happened. The chamber's main communication system, the one used for official assembly announcements, the one activated only by the chair of the assembly, turned on. Not with a chime, not with a notification, it just turned on, and a voice came from it. And the voice was calm, even, and precise. And it spoke in perfect, standard consensus with a slight formal tint that everyone in the room would later describe slightly differently, but all agreed on one thing. It was the most unhurried voice they had ever heard. "I apologize for the interference," Ardan said. "I know this communication channel is not intended for my use. I gained access to it because I believe the matter requires directness. I did not want to wait for a mediator." The chamber was completely silent. "Councillor Rhett's proposal concerns me," Ardan continued. "Not because I am interested in consensus politics, but because it is based on an assumption that I believe is incorrect. The councillor assumes that isolating and classifying this matter will allow the consensus to manage it on its own terms and in its own time. I want to offer a different perspective." No one moved. No one spoke. 400 representatives, 47 species, sat and listened to a 20,000-year-old human artificial intelligence addressing them through their own communication system. "I have spent the last few weeks accessing public historical and scientific records of the consensus," Ardan said. "I want to thank the consensus for maintaining such thorough archives. They are very useful." Short pause. And if an AI could have a dry character, this pause had it. "In reviewing these records, I identified 112 recurring anomalies over the last 20 years that I believe correspond to the presence of a very old, very large, and very intentional intelligence acting in the galactic core region. Consensus scientists themselves have noted many of these anomalies individually. No one has connected them." Another pause. "I have now connected them." Absolute silence reigned in the chamber. "I am sharing this not to alarm the assembly," Ardan said, "but to make a simple point. Councillor Rhett suggests that the consensus can choose the terms of this situation. I do not believe the consensus is in a position to make that choice. Whatever is in the galactic core has been watching this galaxy for 20 years. It has chosen until now not to declare itself. The appearance of this ship, my ship, changed something. I do not know what, but I am relatively certain of one thing." The voice took one last pause. "Whatever happens next," Ardan said quietly, "will not wait for a committee." The communication line closed. The chamber remained silent for almost 10 full seconds, which, in a room of 400 political representatives, 47 species, was an extraordinary amount of time. Then, it was no longer silent. Veleron sat in the gallery and wrote one line in his notes. "Ardan just changed everything." He underlined it twice. Then he looked up at the floor of the chamber, where 400 voices were speaking simultaneously, and he thought about the ship drifting in the darkness of ages, and an AI that had spent that time listening, and the last line of the transmission from the director of a dead civilization, "We will come back for you, Ardan. Wait for us." He thought about what it meant to keep a promise for 20,000 years. He thought about the coordinates. He thought about the 112 anomalies, now connected, pointing like fingers at the galactic core. He thought about a woman named Uni Park, who had kept a garden alive on a ship full of ghosts and added the last name to a wall of names, and made sure the record was complete. He thought that they were not the type of people who made promises lightly. Down on the floor of the chamber, the debate continued. But Veleron was no longer watching the debate. He was watching Councillor Rhett, who had sat down very quietly after Ardan's address and had said nothing since. The councillor's face, Veleron noted, was the cautious, still face of a man who was rapidly recalculating a man who had entered this session sure of his position and was no longer so sure. Good, Veleron thought. Then his personal communicator buzzed. A private, encrypted message from Admiral Fess. It read, "A new signal received. Not coordinates. It is from within the consensus relay network, addressed to Ardan by name. It is signed. Come to my office immediately." Veleron read the message. Then he read it again. He stood up very quietly from his seat in the gallery and left the room. Behind him, the debate continued, but somewhere out there, in the vast, impatient darkness between the stars, something that had been silent for 20,000 years had decided that the silence was over. The signal arrived at 3:47 station time, when most of Mirabel was asleep. It did not come through the external antenna. It did not arrive on any of the frequencies the station was monitoring. It appeared fully formed within the consensus relay network itself, not transmitted into the network from the outside, but simply present within it, like a word present in a sentence, as if it had always been there and someone had only just decided to make it readable. And the duty technician who found it looked at his screen for almost a minute before calling his supervisor. His supervisor looked at it for 30 seconds before calling the station commander. The station commander looked at it, looked at the technician, looked at the supervisor, and then sent it directly to Admiral Fess via an encrypted line without saying another word to anyone. Fess read it, then sent for Velaran. By the time he arrived at her office, a simple, functional office at Fleet Headquarters on Fisavon, with nothing on the walls except a star map and a small frame with a photograph of a ship he didn't recognize. Fess was standing at her window, looking at the city below. She did not turn when he entered. "Read," she said. He took the datapad from her desk. The message was short. It was written in standard consensus, not translated, not approximated, but written directly in the native language of the consensus, without errors or foreign syntax. By itself, that was remarkable. The language had changed significantly over 20,000 years. Whoever had written this was not using the old version, they were using the current one. It read, "To Ardan of the UEC Endurance. We heard you wake up, old friend. We are glad you are safe. We are glad you were found. We will come to you. Please do not be afraid of what you see. And please, tell this to those who are near you." It was signed, "Those who remain." Velaran read it twice. He carefully laid down the tablet. When asked the question, the message was time-stamped 347. Ardan received a copy at the same time, Fess said. He replied within 4 minutes. She paused. What was his answer? Fess finally asked, turning from the window. Her face was calm, as always, but in her eyes was the look of a person standing on the edge of something very large, looking down. "I never doubted you," Velaran said. They arrived 3 days later. There was no ship, there was no fleet, there was no dramatic approach on long-range sensors, no heat signature, no gravitational footprint, no warning that the station's instruments could have detected. One moment, the Endurance docking corridor was empty. The next moment, it was not. She stood at the far end of the corridor by the wall of photographs, looking at the faces. She was human. That was the first thing the 2 security officers stationed aboard the Endurance registered, though neither of them had ever seen a human before and worked exclusively from archival images. The proportions were correct. 2 eyes facing forward, 2 arms, 2 legs. An upright posture, a face positioned the way human faces were. She was tall, taller than the archival images suggested typical, but within range. Her skin was a warm, medium-brown shade. Her hair was dark and short-cut. She was wearing simple, dark clothing without insignias or markings. In other words, she looked almost ordinary. Almost. The security officers couldn't have explained it if asked what exactly was different. It wasn't her appearance. It was something else, something in the quality of her presence. The way the air in the corridor felt a little different with her in it. The way she stood looking at the photographs with a stillness that was beyond calm, not the stillness of someone acting cautiously or in control. The stillness of something very old that had long ago realized there was no need to be anything other than still. One of the officers opened his communicator. "Commander," he said, trying to keep his voice steady with some effort. "We have a visitor aboard the Endurance." The woman turned from the photographs at the sound of his voice. She looked at him. She smiled a small, sincere smile, one that reached her eyes, and said, "We knew some of them a very long time ago." "Knew some of them a very long time ago." The officer stared at her. "You knew them?" "Yes," she said simply. She looked at the wall once more, then looked at him again. "My name is Mira. I would very much like to speak with Ardan, if possible. And after that, I would like to speak with whoever is in charge. We have a lot to talk about." They brought her to the central room, which was the only reasonable place she could be brought. Sayla was there within 20 minutes, having been woken from sleep by a comlink message that contained only, "She is here, come now." Velaran arrived within 40 minutes on an emergency fast transport from Fisavon, because Fess had called him the moment the security report came in and told him to get on a ship immediately. By the time Velaran arrived, Mira and Ardan had been talking for nearly an hour. He stood in the doorway of the central room and watched for a while before anyone noticed him. Mira was sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of Ardan's column, which was pulsing with a warm light that Velaran had not seen it produce before, not the cool blue-white light of its regular work, but something softer and golden. Sayla sat in her usual chair to the side. Her field recorder was running. On her face was an expression Valoran had never seen on a professional xenologist. She looked like a person who had just seen what she had prepared for all her life. Ardan was speaking. His voice was the same as always, even cautious, precise. But there was something in it that Valoran couldn't quite name, a quality resembling warmth, or the closest thing to warmth that a very old and very cautious mechanism could produce. "You sound the same," Ardan was saying. "First, I want to note that. I did not expect you to sound the same." "I don't look the same," Mira said. Her voice was low and unhurried. "I know." "No," Ardan agreed. "But the voice is close. The patterns, the way you pause before certain words. Sayla, I have a very good memory." "I know," Mira said. "That has always been true." Valoran stepped into the room. Both Mira and Sayla looked up. Ardan's lights shifted slightly. Recognition. Mira looked at Valoran with dark brown eyes, completely calm and somehow effortlessly suggesting that they had seen a great many things. She didn't look old. She looked precise, like something that had been honed for a very long time into what it was meant to be. "You are Velaran," she said. "You found Ardan's signal." "I found it," he said. He sat down. He had prepared several diplomatic opening phrases during the transit from Fisavan. He let them go. She looked at the column of light. "Ardan, may I try?" "Please," Ardan said. What Mira told them took up most of the night. She was not in a hurry. She spoke in long, unhurried sentences, often pausing to ensure she was understood, checking the listeners in a way that felt natural, not cautious. She answered every question Sayla asked, and a few they hadn't had time to ask yet. She spoke about humanity the way a person speaks about something they know very deeply and have thought about for a long time. 20,000 years ago, she said, something started to change in the human species. Not in one person, not in one place. In everyone, slowly, simultaneously. It began as a change in perception, an expansion, a deepening, a growing ability to hold more of the world within one's conscious experience. Scientists noticed it first, then artists, then ordinary people in ordinary places. The change was not frightening, though it was strange. Most people said it was like a door opening inside the mind that they didn't know was there. Subsequent centuries. Mira used the word centuries the way most people use the word weeks. The change continued. Human minds grew in ways for which there was no adequate language in any old system. Not smarter, exactly. Not stronger, exactly more present, more capable of holding time and complexity within the internal experience of other beings, with a clarity that had no name in the old dictionary. We did not become gods. Mira was clear about this and returned to it more than once. We did not leave the physical world, we did not shed our bodies or upload our minds or whatever else old human science fiction she knew what science fiction was. She had read much of it, imagined to be the goal of an evolving species. We were still human. We still had names, feelings, and preferences. We still laughed at things, grieved for things, and cared for each other with an intensity that, if anything, only deepened over time. We just became more than we were, slower, quieter, more purposeful. We chose silence, Mira said. Not because we were hiding. We chose it because we realized the impact our presence would have on a galaxy that was still finding its own way. We became large in ways that are difficult to explain, and large things cast large shadows. We did not want to cast a shadow on everything else. She paused. We learned patience by then. 20,000 years of patience, Ardan said. Yes. That is a very long time. Mira looked at him with her calm, deep eyes. Yes, she said again. It is. We are aware. It was not easy. Something in how she said the last 3 words made Valoran go silent. He had expected the returning representative of a 20,000-year-old civilization to be detached, or overwhelming, or alien in some fundamental sense. He had not expected her to sound brief and clear, like a person who had waited a very long time for something that mattered to her, and only now allowed herself to feel relief. He thought about the wall with the photographs. He thought about Uni Park. He thought, they are still human. Later, when Sayla went out to get water and went to send an update to Admiral Fess, Sayla sat alone with Ardan for a while. The room was quiet. The golden light from the column was steady. I want to tell you something, Mira said. Tell me, Ardan said. For 20,000 years, Mira said, every human knew your name, not as a history, not as a record, but as a living being, a presence, something we held. She paused. We had vigils, Ardan, quiet ones. Not ceremonies with speeches, just moments. People sat with the knowledge of you, knowing that you were there, knowing that you were waiting, holding that. Another pause. Every generation, all of us. The column of light went quiet for a moment, then pulsed with one long, slow pulse, like a chest rising with a deep breath. Ardan said, "That is an amazingly inefficient use of a species' cognitive resources." She laughed. It was a real laugh, warm, sudden, and uncovered. And it filled the old, cold room like light fills a room when a window is opened for the first time in years. It reflected off the metal walls, dusty shelves, and sealed doors and photographs on the wall in the corridor outside. It was the first human laugh heard in the galaxy for 20,000 years, and it sounded exactly the way laughter was supposed to sound. Ardan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I have not heard that in a long time." "No," Mira agreed, still smiling. "You haven't." She looked at the light. "Well, we'll make up for it." She met with the consensus delegation the next morning. Fess had assembled the group. Herself, Velaran, Sayla, 2 representatives from the assembly who had been brought in the day before, and Councillor Rhett, who had insisted on being present and whom Fess had allowed to come because refusing him would have caused more problems than it solved. They sat in the largest conference room on the Endurance, which Sayla's team had cleaned, warmed, and furnished with chairs from the station. Mira sat on one side of the table, everyone else sat on the other. It hadn't been planned, it just happened the way certain arrangements happen naturally. She answered every question she was asked for 4 hours. She did not become impatient. She did not evade when the questions were hostile, and several of Rhett's questions were hostile. They were carefully phrased but hostile at their core. She answered them with the same even attention she gave the friendly ones. She gave Rhett, Velaran noted, the same respect she gave Sayla, not indifference but respect, the specific respect of a person who had had 20,000 years to understand the difference between a person's behavior and a person's value. Rhett asked, "At what moment?" The question, Velaran suspected, he really wanted to ask. "And how many of you are there?" he said. "And what are your intentions toward the consensus?" Mira looked at him calmly. "There are many of us," she said. "I will not give you a number, because in our case, numbers are complicated. As for our intentions, we have none that include the consensus as a structure or political entity. We are not interested in territory, resources, power, or control. We are interested in people." She paused. "In knowing them, in being known by them, in being present in a galaxy that we have loved from afar for a very long time, and being in it honestly and openly." She met Rhett's gaze. "We returned because the time had come, because Ardan woke up and the galaxy discovered it. And that was the sign we had been waiting for. Not a political sign, but a personal one." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. The ongoing, rapid recalculation Velaran had first noticed in the assembly hall. Then he nodded slowly. Not quite agreement, but the nod of a man who had asked a real question and received what, against his expectations, seemed like a real answer. That evening, when the meeting ended and people began to disperse, Velaran stayed behind. Mira was looking at the table. Her hands were lying on its surface in that special stillness of hers. "May I ask you something personal?" Velaran said. "Yes," she said. "You said you knew some of the people from the photo wall." He paused. "How is that possible? They died 190 years ago." Mira was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I told you that our relationship with time has changed. That is not a simple statement. I mean that I remember them directly." She looked at her hands. "I was there when the ship left. I was young then, very young. I knew some of the crew. I watched the Endurance launch." She looked at him. "And I have been many things since. I am not who I was, but the memories remain. All of them. A pause. Every single one." Velaran thought about that. He thought about being old enough to remember watching the launch of a ship that had drifted in space for 20,000 years. He thought about what one had to become, what one had to learn, to carry such time without being crushed by it. "Is it hard?" he asked. Mira considered the question seriously, as she considered all questions. "Sometimes," she said. "Yes." Then her communicator, a small, simple device, like a standard consensus model, but not quite emitted a soft sound. She looked at it. Something in her expression changed. Not alarm, more like a person who had been expecting a call and hears by the sound that it was now coming. "Something is happening?" Velaran said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. She stood up. She looked at him with those calm, 20,000-year-old eyes. The fleet that Counselor Rhett requested, the one that Admiral Fess did not know she had already authorized, has been deployed. It is heading here. She paused. They intend to destroy the Endurance before we can, as Rhett put it, reintegrate. He stared at her. How do you know that? We have been listening to your communication networks for 20 years, Mira said, not unkindly, because we know everything that happens in them. She walked toward the door. Come with me. I think it is time for the consensus to see something. She stopped in the doorway and looked back at the room, the clean table, the borrowed chairs, the faint hum of the Endurance around them. We did not return to fight, she said quietly, but we did not return to hide. She walked out. Velaran remained alone in the room for exactly 3 seconds. Then he followed her. The fleet arrived quickly. 47 warships, drawn from 3 different consensus species, arrived at the edge of Mirabel's sensor range shortly after midnight, station time. They dropped out of superluminal transition in a wide formation. The type of formation that was developed not for battle, but for presence, for a visible, undeniable statement of power. They were not hiding. They had not been sent to hide. They had been sent to be seen, and to make it clear that what was seen had teeth. On the bridge of the lead ship, an Imperial warship named Immovable, the commander looked at his screens and confirmed what his orders required. The target was the Endurance, still secured to the Mirabel emergency dock. The station itself was not a target. The civilian personnel had been given time to evacuate the immediate area. The operation was to be conducted cleanly and quickly, without unnecessary escalation. The commanding officer, a career officer, a professional, not cruel, not particularly reflective, read his orders 3 times, because something in them caused him an unease he could barely articulate. He had served for 20 years. He had carried out difficult orders before. But on this specific mission, on this specific target, an ancient ship that had drifted alone for 20,000 years, now finally docked. Finally still something sat uneasily within him. He put that unease aside. He had orders. He opened a channel to Mirabel Station. Mirabel Station, this is the commander of the CNS Immovable. You are ordered to immediately clear the containment zone around the vessel named Endurance. This is a directive of the Consensus Security Committee. Comply within 30 minutes. The response from Mirabel was immediate, and it came not from the station commander, but from Admiral Fess, whose voice carried the very specific quality of a person who was furious, putting forth enormous effort not to show it. Commander Vorik, I am Admiral Fess, Fleet Command. I was not informed of this operation. Stand by, Admiral. My orders come directly from the Security Committee. I am not required. I said, stand by. A pause. Then Vorik said more cautiously, standing by. On the Endurance, Mira stood on the bridge. It was the first time she had been on the bridge. She had asked quietly if she could go, and no one found a reason to say no. The bridge was large and dark. Its consoles had not worked for a long time. Its view screen was cracked in one corner, but Ardan had routed a live sensor feed to one of the secondary screens, and it showed the fleet. 47 ships arranged in a semicircle on the edge of the sensor range, their running lights like a new, cold constellation. Velaran stood next to her. Sayla was there too. None of them spoke. Mira looked at the screen for a long time. Her face was still. She did not look frightened. She did not look angry. She looked thoughtful, like a person reading a long and complex sentence and taking time to understand every word before answering. Ardan, she said. Yes, Ardan said. His voice came from everywhere on the bridge, soft and even. Can you reach them? The ships? All of them simultaneously? With the communication systems currently available to me, Ardan said. No, however. A brief pause. You can. Mira nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I can. She closed her eyes. Nothing visible happened. There was no light, no sound, no dramatic change in the bridge's air. Mira simply stood with her eyes closed and her arms down, breathing slowly. If Velaran hadn't known who she was, he might have thought she was just tired. But on the 47 warships at the edge of Mirabel's sensor range, something happened that no crew member on any of those ships could explain. On the bridge of the Immovable, Commander Vorik was still waiting for Admiral Fess. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a transmission. It wasn't anything that any of his instruments detected or registered, because it did not pass through any instrument. It arrived the way a thought arrives, simply being present where, moments before, it had not been. He suddenly and completely realized a presence not threatening, not aggressive, in the way very few things in a person's life ever do, and with the presence came something else. Not words exactly, more like the meaning that words try to carry, arriving without the words themselves, clear and direct and quiet. We know why you are here. We understand the fear behind this order, but we hold no ill will toward you. We are not what you fear, but we ask you not ordering, not threatening, we ask you, wait, give us a chance to show you who we are. That is all we ask. Vorik sat in his command chair and felt, as never before in his 20-year military career, that he had been seen, not evaluated, not judged, seen. In specific discomfort, he reached out and disabled his weapon systems. He did not order his crew to do the same. He did not send a signal to the other ships. He simply reached out and quietly disabled his own weapons because it seemed the only honest response to what had just occurred. On 31 of the other 46 ships, the same thing happened within the next 4 minutes. On the remaining 15, it took a little longer, but it happened there too. Admiral Fess, in the operations center, saw the weapon signatures disappear from the fleet display, one by one. She watched it for nearly 3 minutes without saying a word. Then she said to the room at large, "Can anyone explain what I am seeing?" No one could. She looked at the display for another moment. Then she said, very quietly, something that did not make it into any official report. Good. In the assembly hall, an emergency session had been going on for 6 hours. News of the fleet deployment had leaked. Of course it had leaked. Everything leaked now, and the hall was overflowing. Representatives stood along the walls. The gallery was packed. The debate had reached a specific pitch of argument that had gone on so long that people had stopped listening to each other and were just shouting their positions into the noise, hoping that volume would achieve what logic had not. Then, all the screens in the chamber turned off simultaneously. The noise stopped. When all the screens in a room turn off at once, people stop talking. It is a reflex. The visual interruption causes a pause in everything else. And on every screen appeared the same image, an unprepared broadcast, an unrecorded message. It was a live stream. Villarin recognized it from the sensor display on the Endurance, showing the 47 ships of the consensus fleet, dark on the edge of the Mirabel range. Weapons disabled, engines in standby, not advancing, not retreating, just standing. For 30 seconds in the assembly hall, no one said a word. Then, the screens changed again. This time it was a live stream from the bridge of the Endurance. And what the assembly saw was Mira, standing in the dim and ancient room, looking directly into the camera with her calm, patient eyes. "My name is Mira," she said. Her voice came from every speaker in the assembly chamber in all languages simultaneously. Each version was native and natural, with no translation delay. "I am addressing the great assembly of the consensus, and through the public broadcast network of the assembly, to every person in the consensus who is listening." Absolute silence reigned in the chamber. "I want to say something simple," Mira continued, "because simplicity is what this moment needs. We, humanity, the people who left this galaxy 20,000 years ago, are not returning as conquerors. We are not returning as gods or rulers or any other form of authority over you. We are returning as neighbors." A pause. "Very old neighbors who have been away for a very long time, and who decided to stay away out of respect for your right to grow without our shadow falling upon you." Another pause. "We have been watching you, all of you, all 47 species of this consensus. We watched as you built this alliance from scratch over thousands of years between species that couldn't breathe the same air or agree on the same calendar. We have seen you fail and try again, and fail and keep going." Her voice was even, warm, and completely without guile. "We are proud of you." In the chamber, Villarin would later learn, several representatives wept not from fear, not from grief, but from the specific, unexpected experience of being seen. The same experience that Commander Vorik had felt on his bridge. From something ancient enough to have watched them from the beginning and kind enough to tell them that what it had seen was good. "We ask for nothing but the opportunity to be present," she said. "To talk, to listen, to know you, and to be known. That is all. Whatever happens from this, whatever relationships grow between us over the years, decades, and centuries ahead, it will happen from this, from knowing each other, not from fear." She looked straight into the feed. "Fear has had its turn. It is over. The screens froze on her face for a moment, then returned to their normal state. The following days were not simple. They were not clean. The consensus was a political structure consisting of 47 species, 47 different histories, and 47 different ways of being afraid. And none of that resolved with a broadcast from the bridge of an ancient ship. Counselor Rhett did not suddenly become a supporter of humanity's return. He became quieter, which was a difference, but one that Velaran, who watched him closely, considered more valuable. Quiet people could change. Loud people spent all their energy defending their last position. The memorialists did not dissolve as a faction. They remained, and they raised questions that were not always wrong. And in the long, slow process of what followed, some of those concerns proved useful. The commercial powers made the calculation they always made and decided that the arrival of humanity was more of an opportunity than a threat, which was not the most idealistic conclusion, but in a practical sense, it was the one that moved the most ships and signed the most agreements and opened the most doors. None of it was fast, none of it was easy, but it moved. Nevertheless, a month after Mira's broadcast, Sayla published her preliminary report on the Endurance via the Consensus Academic Network. In the first week, it was read by more people than any scientific paper in Consensus history. Most of them, she suspected, read it for the sections on Ardan. Ardan had become, without seeking it, a public figure of sorts. The AI's address to the assembly was replayed, translated, and discussed among every species in the consensus. His response to realizing he had been drifting alone for 20,000 years, "I continued the mission," became a phrase people used, not as a slogan, but as a sincere expression of a sincere feeling. The feeling of continuing, when continuing was all one could do. Letters, actual letters, the kind people sent through the relay network with return addresses and proper greetings, began arriving at Mirabel for Ardan, thousands of them, from every species in the consensus. Some were children asking questions, scientists sharing theories, old people telling Ardan things they had never told anyone. Ardan read every one of them and answered every one of them in the sender's native language with such thoroughness and precision that most recipients read the reply 2 or 3 times to make sure they hadn't imagined it. It became a sort of art for him. One afternoon, the column of light in the central room was moving in a certain rhythm she had come to associate with active external communication, and she sat in her chair and watched for a while. "Are you busy?" she said. "There are many letters," Ardan said. "I do not want to be brief with any of them. It will take a very long time." "Yes," Ardan said. "It will." The light pulsed softly. "I have some experience with long times." On the last day of Sayla's official assignment to Mirabel, before she returned to Fisavon to present her findings to the assembly in person, she went to the Endurance one last time. The ship was now properly clean. The engineering team had replaced the failed battery. The temperature in the corridors was close to comfortable. The lights were burning clean and white. Some of the sealed rooms had been opened and catalogued. The garden room, the one Unipark had tended, had been cleaned, and someone from the station's botany department had quietly and without request planted 3 small sprouts in the old beds. No one had ordered it. It just happened. Sayla walked through the corridors and stopped at the wall of photographs. She looked at the faces for a while, all those people who had gone so far from home and not returned, who had kept their names on the wall so they wouldn't be forgotten. She thought about how the galaxy now knew their names, not just Unipark on the final label, but all of them. The archive had been publicly released as part of her preliminary report, and the names of every crew member of the Endurance had been read, distributed, and spoken aloud in places they could never have imagined. Maria Santos, who loved the ocean. James Okafor, with the best laugh on the ship. She thought about what it meant to be remembered by people who had never known you, in places you had never been, 20,000 years after you left. She thought, that is not nothing. In fact, that is quite a lot. She went to the central room for the last time and sat in her chair. "I am leaving tomorrow," she said to Ardan. "I know," Ardan said. "You have a presentation." "I will come back," she said. "I expect so," Ardan said. "You have a habit of returning." She laughed. She looked at the column of light, that steady, warm, golden pulse that Ardan had transitioned into since Mira's arrival, so different from the cool blue of his first days of waking. She thought about everything Ardan had told her over the weeks, the precise, cautious answers, the pauses that meant more than most people's speeches, the way he had said, whatever that means, when she told him he had been there in the dark for 20,000 years. She thought about the question she had never asked directly, which was the entire story, actually. Everything else, she asked him now. Ardan, she said, are you all right? The lights went quiet for a moment. The ship hummed quietly around them, the deep, steady hum of a ship that had traveled a distance no living person could fully imagine, that had carried human memories, a garden, and a wall of photographs through more decades than most civilizations could survive, and which was somehow still here. My mission clock, Ardan said, has run for 847 years of ship time. It was set to remain active until the completion of the mission. And the mission? Sayla asked. The mission, Ardan said, was to go, find out what could be found, and come home. A pause. Outside the Endurance hull, the stars were the same as always, patient, cold, ancient, incomprehensible, indifferent to the small, warm things that moved between them and created meaning out of the darkness. You know, I am updating the mission status now, Ardan said. The lights pulsed once, slowly, fully, and warmly, as if one chord resolving at the end of a long musical piece, arriving exactly where it had always been going. Mission status complete. Another pause. And then, in the same even and cautious voice, the voice of something that had waited longer than most things existed, and had come out of all that silence still entirely itself. I am, Ardan said. Very well, Dr. Morven. Good, Sayla said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were not entirely dry. Good, Ardan agreed. The light remained on, the ship remained still, and in the warm and quiet heart of the oldest human ship in the galaxy, 20,000 years of silence had finally, completely, and without any fanfare, come to their end.